Welcome, everybody. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Robin Darling-Young, who's going to give us the second TeTra Lecture of the year. Robin Darling-Young is Ordinary Professor of Church History at the Catholic University of America. She received her PhD in the History of Christianity from the University of Chicago with a thesis entitled The Patriarchate Severus of Antioch, 512, 518. She, besides teaching at the University of America, she has taught at the University of Notre Dame and has been a visiting professor at the University of Chicago and the University of Virginia. Her research interests are broad and cover much of the history of early Christianity and its thought, with a special focus on spiritual interpretation, the history of asceticism and monastic thought, or the Christian culture of ancient Syria and Armenia, as well as Jewish-Christian relationships, or the role of women in martyrdom and mysticism. Her contributions to the field of Syriac and Armenian studies, but also Greek, Latin, and Coptic Christianity are substantial, and I can hardly do justice to them with this brief introduction. So I will leave it myself to mention only two of her publications: the volume edited in 2023 for CSCO with Josep Carapteyan, entitled Evagrius of Pontus, Letters, Armenian Translation, and the monograph In Procession Before the Word, Martyrdom as Public Liturgy in Early Christianity of 2001. Professor Darling-Young's contributions, though, are not limited to her teaching and writing, but she has also been and is also still very active in putting her expertise to the service of different committees and societies. For instance, she has been part of the organizing committee of the Syriac Studies Symposium, or she's been an editor for the Society of Biblical Literature Group on Asceticism in Greco-Roman Antiquity, or a member of the consultation team Armenian Church Observed, and part of the board of consultors of the Syrian Orthodox Academy. Moreover, in 2018-2020, Professor Darling-Young has been president of the North American Patristical Society, and since 2021, she's a member of the Vatican International Theological Commission. Today, Robert Darling-Young will present a paper entitled The Transformation of the Letters of Evagrius from Greek to Syriac and Armenian. Robin, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Georgia and all. It's an honor to be here in cyberspace with you, and I'm very happy that you would want to hear about the movement of Evagrius's letters, or at least as much as we can say about it, from their original Greek to Syriac and to Armenian, during the process of which they change remarkably. And I'll be discussing that. My remarks will stay on the level of the general, but I'm happy to entertain more detailed questions if anybody has them, and hope I can answer them. I have to begin by, well, first asking that the slide could go up on the screen. And Georgia has kindly agreed to move the slides for me, which I appreciate since I can only do one or two things at once. Thank you. I realize now that it's appropriate to begin with this very familiar slide of Evagrius, because I am speaking to people in Northern Europe, and this slide is an engraving of Evagrius from the late 16th century by a Flemish engraver, Johann Zadler. And it shows Evagrius as the tradition came to understand him, a solitary, obsessed with books, living at a respectable distance from other solitaries in a landscape that is not, in fact, Kellia, but looks more like, well, I guess, like Belgium. And the last slide I'll say right now is a woodcut of Evagrius as a Mechitarist monk. That will highlight his Armenian character. Okay, so to begin, I have to thank, in addition to my first Armenian teacher, Gabriela Winkler, whom we discussed earlier, I have to thank for the suggestion of working on the letters of Evagrius, my colleague David Brackey, who is a Coptic scholar in the United States, and suggested some years ago that I work on the letters of Evagrius, since they were preserved in Syriac and no one had translated the complete corpus yet. I was very glad for that suggestion, and indeed I took up the task of translating from Frankenberg's late 19th century edition. It's a diplomatic edition, the letters of Evagrius, and then held off on doing anything about it until finally, like the dawn breaking, this appeared earlier this year, namely Origen's Evagrius Lecture, which has the entire collection, not including the Armenian version, which is quite different. And this, of course, is a critical edition that makes possible a number of things having to do not only with the translation of the Syriac and Greek letters, but also their interpretation. His interpretation, of course, is very broadly based in his knowledge of the works of Evagrius that he has prepared for Sources Chrétiennes. So that's where this project came from. The Armenian version of it was made while I was waiting for Jean's edition, and that was a project with a graduate student of mine, Father Josep Karapetian, who has prepared critical editions and translations of the first trilogy of Evagrius translated into Armenian. And I'll say something about that later, because that is very important for the history of the transmission of Evagrius into Armenian. But let me take a step back from these textual matters for a minute and just answer the question, who is Evagrius? I know you all know this, or you wouldn't be here, but I have to say in the first instance that I would call him a great-grandson of Origen. The Guillemot and Jean are so right about this and I know this because I'm currently engaged in yet another textual project, the translation with a face in Greek, along with a colleague of mine, of Origen's Contra Celsum, in which the anticipations, if I may put it this way, of Evagrius are all over every page. Evagrius is certainly and deliberately an Origenist, updating Origen now in the third generation of the monastic movement, but as a monastic philosopher, again, giving tribute to the Guillemot, primarily in Egypt. Evagrius, almost without a doubt, drew his knowledge of Origen from his own teachers, Basil of Caesarea and Gregory Nazianzen. And he very probably had a much larger library than the one book that can be securely associated with those two, namely the Philokalia. And this resemblance can also, as I'm sure everyone here knows, be seen in the works of Gregory of Nyssa as well. Nonetheless, Evagrius's joining the communities, the ascetic communities of Egypt, and then the record of him preserved in the Lausiac history, written by his student Palladius, and in later historians, has made him associated to, I think, an unbalanced degree with the later monastic movement. And this characterization of Evagrius has survived, not without contestation, but survived to our own time. Now, I think rather than trying to understand Evagrius through the early ascetic movement of Egypt or through the generations of Origenism, we're actually better off first attempting to understand Evagrius from his own writings. And in his own writings, and I think this is also extremely important because we see this in the letters too, Evagrius is interacting as a Platonist with the late Platonist tradition. So traces of not only of Plato and his works, but also of later works, such as the works of Porphyry, can be found in his writings. Nonetheless, is that as evident in the letters as it is elsewhere? Well, possibly. And then we have to ask the question, what are the letters? So we tend to think of the letters as a collection. This collection has been, of course, published in German based on the Frankenberg edition with some consultation of other manuscripts on the part of Bunge. And these 62 letters are written almost entirely to ascetics that has been preserved in Syriac and excerpted and repurposed in a later Armenian translation. I'm going to describe this later, this process later. A few letters are to lay people, including in that category, female ascetics, and interestingly, one to a lawyer and his wife. And in two long and more complex letters, it's unclear whom he's addressing. These letters are also preserved in Syriac, but one is preserved in Greek. So his letter that has the title either On Faith or To the Caesareans, preserved as Basil letter 8 and therefore preserved in Greek, we don't know whom the addressees are. And the Great Letter, so-called, or the letter to Melania, as it is also known, is certainly addressed to one person, but presumably to whomever else, though that person would have shared it with. There are 4 letters preserved in Greek as introductions to other works. So in other words, in addition to the letter On Faith / to the Caesareans, there are preserved the letter to Anatolius, which opens the collection of the Gnostic trilogy, which I published with a team 2 years ago, the prologue to the chapters on prayer, the prologue to a treatise called To Eulogius, and the prologue to a treatise also written for Eulogius called The Vices Opposed to the Virtues. So that gives us 4 letters preserved in Greek in addition to the letter on faith, as I'll just go ahead and call it now. These letters in Greek display, as do Evagrius's other works, a strong debt to Platonic philosophy as interpreted in the 3rd century in Origen and in the 4th century among the Cappadocian Fathers. And at the same time, certainly reference the ascetic context which Evagrius wanted to address, whatever it was. And I think it's very difficult to establish exactly what this context was, even though Palladius has tried to present it in a certain light in the 5th century in his, what I think can only be described as a defense to the court of Constantinople of the beleaguered monks of Egypt. So these 4 Greek letters that I have mentioned, apart from the letter on faith, display varying degrees of engagement with the Greek philosophical tradition and its Christian ascetic interpretation. And I think we have to think of that as the real foundation of Evagrius's thought, and therefore also the foundation of his letters, even though so far they have not been systematically interpreted that way. I'll just give you an example, for instance, from his letter at the beginning of his Logos to Eulogius the Solitary. He says, "Those who inhabit the heavenly land by their labors are not preoccupied by the stomach, nor by the care of corruptible things, just as those who make prayers for gain and who reckon piety as a source of profit. But they, that is the citizens of the heavenly land, take part thanks to intellectual vision of the nourishing clarity of superior realities, like an undamaged Bacchic troop surrounded by the light from glory." Well, there you have an interweaving of classical references, Evagrius's own understanding of what is the intellectual vision of light, with an orientation to someone who was pursuing the solitary life, but we don't know where or how. So I'll just read you one more sentence from this. "You thus, O Eulogius, initiate of the virtues, nourish your intellectual being, noeron ousion, with the shaping of supreme realities, and with gatherings of calculations you strip and set upon the weight of the flesh, knowing that a material of flesh is food for calculating thoughts." This is how I translate logismos. I can get into that later if there's any interest in it. Evagrius here and in the treatise is in dialogue with Plato, Plotinus, the Cappadocians, and Origen. I'll skip over his letter at the beginning of To the Vices Against the Virtues in the interest of time, and because we want to get to Armenia. But I will point out that the letter to Anatolius that begins his Gnostic trilogy sets himself in a rather different place. "You first wrote to me from the holy mountain," that would be Jerusalem, actually, not Mount Sinai, "requesting that I, living in Scatus, explain to you the symbolic garment of the monks in Egypt, because you believe it neither accidental nor irrelevant, that it is so different from the rest of the vestments of human beings. Therefore, I will declare what we have learned about this vestment from the Holy Fathers." And here Evagrius presents himself as being an heir not of the tradition that stretches from Origen, or actually I should say not Origen, but Philo, Clement, Origen, and the Cappadocians. He presents himself as being an heir of possibly Macarius and others of Nitria. The closing of that letter, which comes at the end of the Practicas, is extremely important, because Evagrius tells you and tells his readers what he's up to. He says, "For now let these things we have said about the priestly vestment and the teaching of the elders suffice. But about the life of practice and the life of knowledge, we will now relate not what we have heard or seen, but only what we have learned from them to tell others. We have concisely divided matters of the life of practice into 100 chapters and matters about the life of knowledge into 50 chapters, in addition to the 600, that is, the Kephala and Gnostica." He concludes by saying, "We have concealed some things and obscured others, lest we give holy things to dogs or cast pearls before swine. But these things will be clear to those who have set forth on the same path. then that, of course, is the path from the life of the practice to the life of gnosis. So Evagrius announces himself as concealing what he really wants to say to those who can get it and who understand him. I will skip also reading the very interesting opening letter to the chapters on prayer. And I will also note that, to my knowledge, this letter is absent from the Armenian translation of the chapters on prayer, which translation was probably made at the beginning of the 6th century. And to my knowledge, it is absent from the Syriac translation of the chapters on prayer, which, as Mr. Yannick noted earlier in our discussion, is fragmentary. This engages in number speculation, which is Evagrius tipping his hat, or perhaps I should say his cowl, to his Pythagorean friends. Now, I want to turn to the 62 letters preserved in Syriac that have been edited by Jean in the recent Source Chrétien version. The introduction and the notes to these letters are absolutely crucial and fascinating, and they are also useful for reading other works of Evagrius. And in one page in particular, Jean has shown how many of Evagrius's letters, I believe he has 10 listed here, draw from, and these are the Syriac letters, draw directly from Evagrius's Greek treatise, treatise that has been preserved in Greek also, the Perilogismon, or On Calculating Thoughts. I'm going to just insist on translating that. This work is a really important work because it contains evidence, I believe, that, how shall we say, supplements Palladius's biographical sketch in the Lausiac history. I don't have time to go into that right now, but I'd be happy to discuss it in the question and answer period. Jean has this to say in his introduction to his edition and translation of the letters. Evagrius's letters are not utilitarian in nature and do not evoke the countless worries that make up the daily life of those involved in worldly affairs, health problems, disputes, political or ecclesiastical problems. And he says this, Jean, because he wants to draw a distinction between the letters of Evagrius and the letters of those who taught Evagrius, such as Basil and the 2 Gregories. They're letters of a different kind entirely, except perhaps the so-called letter on faith. He says, they are letters of a monk who has withdrawn from the world and who considers that all the echoes that come from it are of a nature to disturb his tranquility, hesychia. Jean notes that though his family was far away, letters from them could be disturbing. This raises a really interesting point about Evagrius's life, and that is his constant, or I should say regular, warnings about maintaining contact with a person's family, which would stir memories of lavish banquets, dancing girls, wonderful food and company, etc. In other words, they point to Evagrius's background, but also the background of many of those who were trying to live the ascetic life in his period. Jean discovered a passage in John Cassian's Institutes of the Cenobia, that doubtless refers to Evagrius, his teacher. So I'm going to read this because I think that this also shows you why Evagrius, in the 62 letters preserved in Syriac, does not want to deal not only with the requirements of the secular world, if I may make that distinction at this point, just for convenience. He also does not want to, he doesn't want himself and he doesn't want others to maintain a connection with their family. So Cassian writes this: I consider it no less necessary also to recall this fact of a brother attentive to the purity of the heart. This is a tip-off because Cassian substituted puritas cordis for Evagrius's term apatheia as the goal to which ascetic exercises are aimed. Cassian goes on to say, since after 15 years, several letters had been brought to him from his father, his mother, and a large number of friends from his province of Pontus, well, so this is the giveaway, he took this bundle of letters and, reflecting for a long time within himself, he said, how many thoughts, logismoi, will reading them suggest to me, which will push me either to a joy without content or to a sterile sadness, i.e., a state of unbalance. For how many days, remembering those who write them, will they divert the attention of my heart from the contemplation which is my goal? And after how long will this confusion of mind be eliminated? And by what great labor is this state of tranquility restored again, if the mind, having once been troubled by the impression of the letters, and remembering the words and faces long abandoned, begins to see them once more, to dwell with them, and to be present to them in soul and spirit? Truly, it would not serve. It is no use having left them bodily if through the heart the spirit begins to look at them and abandons back to itself to give it life, a memory which whoever renounces this silence has, like a dead man, abandoned. That's the quotation that Cassian makes. And he says, turning all this over in his heart, he, Evagrius, decided not to open any letter, but even not to unseal the package, for fear that by going over in his mind the names of those who had written them or remembering their faces, he might interrupt the intention of his mind. So he threw the package into the fire to be burned, still tied up as he had received it, saying, go, thoughts of the fatherland, burn them all together, and do not seek from now on to remind me of from what I have fled. Now, we might say that there's some exaggeration in this, but we could also say that Evagrius regards his own letters, the 62 in Syriac, as medicinal. And inasmuch as they are medicinal, this probably, I would say very likely, accounts for their character as less philosophical than, for instance, the letter on faith. Because Evagrius makes it very clear throughout his treatise on perilogismon and throughout the practicos and gnosticos that the ability to see clearly, to think clearly, and to be able to reach the ultimate goal, which is union with the Logos, a person cannot engage in memory of disturbing previous connections, including quite probably father, mother, and friends who would have set him on the path that he first pursued. And that path quite clearly was advancement at the level of imperial officialdom in Constantinople. But we'll have to get back to that later. What Jean says about this quotation from Cassian is, The existence of correspondence shows that Evagrius remained in contact with some of his friends, that is, friends not in Egypt and in Jerusalem, and that he also received letters from people who asked him for advice or addressed him as a spiritual father. The letters also accompany the circulation of people who deliver them by hand and give news by word of mouth. It is often the same people who are responsible for carrying the response upon their return. And in fact, we see these in the letters that Evagrius did engage in. At the end of letter 22, the comings and goings of the deacon Olympos, or Palladius. Now, I will say just one thing very briefly about the letter on faith before going to the Syriac and Armenian versions. The letter on faith, and then again, this is in Jehan, says it is only in Syriac that is correctly attributed to Evagrius. But as I noted earlier, transmitted in Greek under the name of Basil in his 276 letters with the title An Apologia for his withdrawal to the Caesareans, under the name of Gregory of Nyssa, Letter to Those in the Fatherland About Faith, and under the name of Nilus of Ankara, from him when he was in Constantinople with the Blessed Gregory, a letter about faith to those living the monastic life in the fatherland. So the Greek tradition already very early hides this letter in other collections. Jehan remarks that in Syriac, the letter is contained in manuscript, British Library manuscript 17167, a manuscript of the 6th and 7th century. This translation is older than the Greek copies, and its title is Egartha de Hymenutha de Tuvana Evagrios. So Evagrius is in this title blessed. This is a little anticipation of how he will be accursed in the Greek tradition, especially after the 5th century, and need to be hidden under or many of his works need to be hidden under the name of other authors, in particular the ever handy Nilus. But in Syriac, he is Tuvana. In Armenian, I'll just note ahead of time, Evagrius is a saint and has not 1 but 2 days on the calendar, on the festal calendar or the sanctoral calendar of the church. The 62 letters are not conserved in their entirety then, other than in Syriac. And I refer you, of course, to Jehan for a description of the corpus. You can find that on pages 66 through 68. Most of the addressees are unknown, and this was a wide open door through which the Armenian translators walked. Sometimes names appear within the letters themselves, and also significantly in Syriac for the Armenian translation, letters 7 through 8 talk about female monks, one of whom is the deacon Severa. 19 through 20 are also about Severa and where she receives counsel from Evagrius, but otherwise addressees are largely absent, which is why the two translations extant now often have to say to a friend because the addressee is unknown. However, 3 manuscripts in Syriac give Melania as the addressee, which is another little pointer for the Armenian translators, who came much later, as I'll note. And this is the tradition preserved in the Armenian translation. So there's another source for this, and I don't know that this was known in Armenian, but it's very interesting. And that is in letter 133 of Jerome, where we first find Evagrius criticized in a very rude way. Evagrius is implicated in the first Origenist crisis in 399 and 400, but he isn't named. It's only in letter 133 of Jerome, who says, Evagrius Ponticus Hiborita, qui scribit ad virgines, scribit ad monachos, scribit ad eam cuius nomen nigredinis testator perfidiae tenebras. Jerome did not like Melania, nor did he like Rufinus, who was her companion and collaborator in Jerusalem. And to put it as we would say in the States, there's a backstory here, and it's not pretty. So I'll just mention briefly that there is the great letter, or letter to Melania, which I believe one of the participants here is editing and translating. That would be you, right, Adam? This is, and correct me if I'm wrong, complete only in 2 manuscripts, one of which, British Library 14578, calls it To Melania. This letter, Jan thinks, came very late in Evagrius's career. It has 2 parts, each ending with the term amen. And according to Jan, each has a different tonality. The first is theological. The second, he says, is plus scholastique. And certainly Evagrius was capable of a certain scholasticism in his time. Jan says this letter builds up to a, quote, new image in Christian thought, namely that of rivers flowing into the sea, that is, human minds rejoining the Logos, mixing with it, and being totally transformed in it. That part of the letter occupies sections 27 through 30. Jan also notes a quotation in this letter from Plato's Symposium 210d. And if Evagrius knew the Symposium, that could be another reason for his composition of letters to Melania, who might well stand in for Diotima in his own symposium. Finally, this letter, not extant in Armenian as far as I know, or hasn't been discovered yet. According to Jan, the date of composition comes after the Kephalaia Gnostica because it reuses certain lines. And it is similar to the S2 version, that is the unexpurgated or restored version of the Kephalaia Gnostica. The translator is not the same as that of On Faith or the 62 letters. Okay, so I know I'm a little bit behind, but I do want to get to the Armenian, having made these things clear. Now, what does the Armenian do? The Armenian version of the letters completely reorients them. It adapts the text to, well, begin sometime in the first millennium, somewhere in the Armenian realm, possibly in Cilicia, where Evagrius was again being read by the great Armenian thinkers of the period. These letters are translated. As we note in our introduction, that is Hovsep, Karapetyan, and I, there are 3 main features that mark the Armenian text and make it different from the Syriac collection that we know. The first is that the translator and compiler of the collection has recast, by creating titles, the letter as a correspondence between Evagrius and Melania alone. The second is that more than half of the collection preserved in Syriac as a collection, that is, the 62 letters, have been omitted. The third difference is that the compiler decided to include works that are not letters in original Greek, in their original Greek form, but rather are treatises not related to the Syriac tradition of the letter collection. In other words, this is a new work suited for an Armenian audience. And someday, should I be granted enough time in this life, I would like to investigate more fully what that audience might have been, because the translator, of course, doesn't really tell us. This Armenian audience becomes clearer once the collection departs definitively from the order in the Syriac version. So beginning in letter 22, the Armenian translator, and I'll call him also an editor, adopted Evagrius as to a virgin. Then letter 23 is a translation of masters and disciples. Letter 24 translates on perfection, a text Evagrius didn't write. Letter 25 is on the seraphim. Letter 26 translates letter 27 in Syriac. Letter 28 is letter 38 in Syriac. And letter 28 is Syriac 55, letter 29 is Syriac 56, and letter 30 is from another source entirely and is entitled The Beginning of Knowledge, which I think is really important because this signals that perhaps the reader or readers of this collection could then turn to the Kephalaia Gnostica, having been duly introduced. What conclusions can we draw from the text as we have about the reshaping of the collection? Well, it is between a male, the Armenian version is a correspondence between a male and a female ascetic. There's little evidence for female monastics in the period in which this text was created. In early Armenian Christian texts, women are mentioned as martyrs and solitaries, for instance, in the martyrdom of Shushanik. And David Zakarian, in his monograph, The Portrayal of Women in Early Christian Armenian Texts, has collected the evidence for women there. But there's no obvious medieval context for this particular translation. No female monastic tradition or spiritual friendship, such as Evagrius was reputed by Palladius to have had with Melania, and such as was common in early Christianity. Was the text made for an Armenian noblewoman? It's always possible. There's no evidence, but possibility, given the presence in Jerusalem, another possibility for a translation site of Armenian queens, the best known of whom, of course, is Melisende. Other medieval courts where women were literate produced devotional literature for their inspiration, and this may be another example. But finally, it speaks to the status of Evagrius in the Armenian tradition. This is my last paragraph, so relief is on the way. He is regarded as a saint. Georgia, I'm really sorry, but could you skip to the last slide? I forgot about my slideshow. That's the problem here. As with the Syriac from the British Library. Just keep going. Yeah, more Syriac. That's an Armenian, one of the Armenian manuscripts we used from the ever-blessed Matana Duran. And then finally, the last slide. Oh.
So this is all I have.
Oh, dear. Okay, well, I apologize. There is a beautiful slide of Evagrius shown as a Vardapet, which means an ordained teaching monk, in a manuscript held in the Manugyan Library in Detroit, shown with another two monks. And you can access it online through my colleague and friend Joel Kalvas-Mackey's website. At any rate, let me get back to my final paragraph. As with the Syriac tradition, Armenian tradition does not explicitly preserve the textual evidence for Evagrius's connection with Origen, which is real despite the slanders of Jerome and later authors. It doesn't preserve his use of Greek philosophy, including pagan philosophers of the 4th century, nor does it preserve his exegetical works, that is the Armenian tradition. His interest in government and the law, he had legal training, are interpreted entirely through the monastic tradition, and his departure from Constantinople is taken to have been a complete break with his past. That he is a free-floating monk, so to speak, in the Armenian and Syriac tradition, makes him easier to assimilate with the earliest monastic leaders of Armenia, some of whom were influenced by his teacher Basil, Evagrius, that is, and he may even be helped by being from Pontus, on the border of Armenia, and by being associated with Basil, himself associated with Armenian monasticism and the two Gregories. So what we have, I believe, in the Armenian version of the letters is a newly created introduction to the higher teaching of Evagrius, which we have in the usual ascending pattern, beginning in the Armenian tradition with the Gnostikos, then the Praktikos, and then not Kephalia Gnostica, but on prayer, which redirects the entire early Armenian collection toward a monastic life of prayer, which then a later medieval scribe could augment with this letter collection. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm really honored to have been asked to speak to you about this ongoing obsession. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure everyone will join me into thanking you for this extremely interesting lecture today. The floor is now open to questions. Anyone who would like to join in can do so by, well, raising the electronic hand or just wave at the camera. I think it's a small enough group for me to pick that one up. And I, for one, I would love to hear more, even though you said that this is for a future project. I would definitely love to hear more of your thoughts, because I'm sure you have them already in some way or another, about the Armenian audience for a collection that combines the letters with other texts that are fit more for that context, and how that combination projects back on the reception of the letters themselves in that context.
Oh, you want me to address that now?
I'd really love to hear your thoughts before you get to do the proper work on them.
Yes. Well, I have a further thought, which has been sort of nagging at me, and that is that in the period in which these letters were translated into Armenian, translated and adapted into Armenian, Armenia is at the peak of its interchange with the West. That is during the period of the early Crusades and the sort of settlement of Western ascetics in the Holy Land, in Syria, and in Armenia. This really begins the collision, I might say, between the two traditions. And Armenians are very interested not only in their own tradition, but also in what's going on in the West, and they are avid translators. So did they know of correspondence in the West between female monastics and male monastics? And could they have then adapted the part of the letters that they preserved, plus the other documents that they add to make it a complete collection? Could they have thought that then that there would be something in the Armenian tradition which corresponded to this medieval tradition of learned female monks and learned male monks corresponding with each other on spiritual matters? That's a possibility, but I don't know for sure. And I have to thank here, and I want, if possible, to speak to him about this, Father Krikor Maksudyan, who was the one who helped us identify the words that were the tip-off for the medieval origin of this text, and we note that in the introduction. Thanks for the question.
No, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Matteo, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin, for your beautiful presentation. I really looked forward to hear that. And I have a question about many questions, but about Syriac Armenian transmission. Is it possible that Armenians were influenced by the general titles of letters to Melania in general, because, for example, in some Syriac manuscripts, all the letters not inside the letters. It is not a general rework, but the titles, these are the letters to Melania in general. For example, in British Library 17192, and the end it is here ends and the letters to Melania.
Yes.
Obviously, if you look inside, there are male, there are monks, there are other people, but the title is already toward one person, toward Melania. And I was curious if, yes, you have shown that in Armenian there is a general rework, or the letters to Melania, other works inside inside the letters. So it's another type of translation, but I was curious. And if is it possible to find the Syriac Vorlage, and if exists a Syriac Vorlage of the Armenian, or if the Armenian translator editor is so original, she maybe was so original to create a new epistolography of Evagrius.
It could have been a mischievous female Armenian scribe of whom we have records in the medieval period. And I didn't mention that it would have been possible for these letters to have come from Marmatai, for instance, which would then track them up through Tauron instead of through the Western point of access. But I don't know the answer to that question yet. So I think it's a very good question that you raise. But I have to plead ignorance at this point. And one thing that is really interesting that I've noticed with the Armenian Praktikos and Gnostikos and on prayer is that even very early Armenian scribes are really adjusting these, not only not paying attention, as Evagrius would have wanted, to precise equivalences in vocabulary, but also adding pious interpolations that anchored even the early versions, even these early translations, to the Armenian and the monastic tradition. In fact, all of I think the early translation of the Armenian trilogy is extremely valuable for knowing something about early Armenian monasticism that we have not known before. And some people here will remember Nina Garsoyan's judgment that there was really no organized monasticism in Armenia, in the pre-Islamic period. But it seems very clear from the scribe translating Evagrius's letters that in fact there was. And not only in the Hajjagabadum Jark, the so-called discourses of Gregory the Illuminator, but in these very early treatises, we clearly have Armenian monks working on this translation.
Yeah, and if I may say only one thing to that, it is quite the same thing that happens in Syriac first translation. But I think that the Greek manuscripts were so much present in Edessa or other cities where they translated Evagrius that they translated a second time, twice and thrice, because the Greek was different from the first Syriac translation. In Armenian, maybe they translated only once, very likely, and a more pious translation.
You can see, though, in the various manuscripts, Armenian manuscripts, varieties of translation. But you're exactly right about the Syriac manuscripts. There are 3 and sometimes 4 translations of the same thing. If only we knew the names of these scribes and their purposes. They tell us a lot about how Evagrius is being adapted to other contexts.
Thank you very much. Benjamin, you're next.
Yes, thank you, Robin, for your beautiful lecture.
Thank you.
If it was up to me, you could talk 1 hour more.
We can always talk on Zoom, Benjamin.
Okay. I've one thing to show. I already showed it in the beginning. So I'm working myself on Evagrius. This is an icon originally made by George Cordis, but he didn't have a halo. And in the Syriac Orthodox Church, he is a saint, so we added a halo.
Yes.
And some Syriac.
Quite right.
Yeah. So this is made by Stephanie, a friend of mine. We have an iconography group who wants to revive iconography in the Syriac Church. He is born from Saint Isaac, Byzantine style, but with a Syriac cover. Yeah. But that said, you mentioned two eulogius. For my book, I'm also copying from manuscript 14578, the writings to eulogius, and I noticed that it differs very much from the translation of Sienkiewicz, from the Greek ascetic corpus. And I wanted to ask you if you know why, because I think approximately 25% is different. In the Syriac, you have to Acedia added, and on Vainglory, the eighth thoughts are added to Eulogius, and Evagrius doesn't have the how do you say it in English? He doesn't mention Christ much by name. He doesn't say Mashiach or Christ.
Correct.
And this is what I was copying it, and I always copy it, and then afterwards I translate it. I was copying it, and I noticed in Theologius he mentions Christ very much. Do you know why?
I'll think about that.
Okay.
I haven't considered the question. Sorry.
Yeah.
His interest is, he doesn't mention the Trinity very much either. He does in his letter on faith, but he's concerned with assimilation to the Logos. That is his main ascetic concern. So, in my view, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
Matteo Zanandi.
The letter on faith. Do you think that it was preserved in Syriac due to its content, named Trinity, a Trinitarian content, which was very, we can say, fascinating, common, and Basil of Caesarea, treatise, and so on? Do you think that it was maybe a more Orthodox letter? We know that it was written maybe in Constantinople, in Jerusalem. We don't know precisely. And do you think that this letter can be preserved because of its content? And another thing, other two very short things is that Gabriel Bung has shown that Evagrius was considered saint or maybe holy or maybe a good person for many centuries also after, and also if we read Jean de Tegemon history of church in the 18th century, Evagrius, it was not condemned, we can say, in Occident. And one last thing is that John Cassian quotation is rewritten by Émile Cioran. Emile Surin has rewritten this beautiful sentence of John Cassian to stress the ascetic, we can say, fly from the world. But yes, then we know that Evagrius was more complicated and he was care about his family. But yeah, returning about letter on faith, maybe it's more orthodox content is
I think that's
the main
yes.
reason.
I think that's highly likely. It's certainly more so than the letter to Melania, the great letter. And as this whole discussion has shown, it's very difficult to verify what then emerges in the later iterations of this tradition. Scribes write what they need to write sometimes, and what Evagrius would have thought about this series of translations, we can't know, but I think in some cases he would be quite frustrated. The interesting thing, of course, and we have Joel and I published a volume on this, The Legacy of Evagrius, and we, it's very interesting to see how the reception of Evagrius is most positive at the furthest east and the furthest west of his distribution compass, so to speak. In the west, not so much a problem. That could be due in part to the well-deserved bad reputation of Jerome, but it can also be due to John Cassian's adaptation, and the way in which Evagrius sort of accompanies Cassian. Likewise, the Syriac realm and the Armenian realm, which just are not subject, after the mid-5th century to imperial diktat. So they're free to make him a saint if they want to.
Thank you very much. Andy, I believe you have a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This talk has really sort of given me some ideas. First of all, I just wanted to, because you mentioned the Armenian commemoration of Evagrius, because I'm working on the Menologia. I checked the Menologion of Joseph, which is supposed to be the earliest translation from Greek, and it actually doesn't commemorate Evagrius, which sort of proves the point that it's a Byzantine one. But it's interesting there that it's actually the two manuscripts are 13th and early 14th century, which seems to suggest some kind of Chalcedonian context. So there is some variation in the Armenian reception. But I wanted to go back to sort of the issue of these earlier translations. So Evagrius is you mentioned there's different variations in these early translations. Do you think some of it might also have to do with the fact that some of them might still be reading Evagrius in Greek, some of the Armenians, rather than consulting translations?
Oh, I'm glad you raised that point. I think absolutely, yes. In these first generations, especially after the Hellenizing school period of Armenia, it's very likely that they would have read Greek along with Syriac. Or maybe, and I think rightfully in this case, have favored the Greek to the exclusion of the Syriac. And then, of course, the Greek manuscripts don't get preserved. But thank you.
And for the last question, I believe, Georgia, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot today, and I have an ignorant question. Again, on the Armenian translation, you mentioned all the differences compared to the other, like the editorial differences. I was wondering whether there's something in the translation itself that betrays some choice-orienting choices, like the choices that want to do a render reader. And if I got correctly, something you said in your first answer to Matteo, do we see multiple translations in the Armenian itself, or something that can tell us whether the editor was also the translator, sorry. I'm thinking, for instance, of the material that is not from the letters, whether it is translated in the same style as the rest. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yes, I think that there was one compiler and they have used the compiler has used the same style throughout. Later vocabulary appears throughout. Yeah, so that's the answer to that question. Can you remind me of your first question, the first part of your question? Sorry.
Yeah, whether you can see some translation choices that you think might be aiming at orientating the readers toward one reading or another. Some translations that are very diverging from the original or from the Syriac.
Well, that's very difficult to say, because Armenian at this point, well, I would say yes, provisionally. At this point, the Armenian tradition this is long past the fork in the road with the Syriac tradition, and the Armenian tradition is its own tradition. Using, but if I may make this distinction, using but not consulting the Syriac tradition as authoritative. So it has made not an elegant, a serviceable translation, but one that attempts to put the letters in dialogue with earlier Armenian writings and not betray their debt to Syriac. It's only the one slip, actually, that we noted that that shows that it's a translation from Syriac. So in other words, they've put it back. The translator and scribe have put it back into a kind of colloquial early medieval Armenian, not reflecting Syriac syntax, etc.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
And on this note, I would love to extend our thanks to our distinguished speaker today, Robin Darling-Young, and thank you for a wonderful and illuminating lecture.
Well, it's really my pleasure. It's so great to speak with all of you, and thank you so much. Bye-bye, Matteo. I see you keep coming in and out, but thanks so much, and may the future for all of us be bright. Bye-bye.
It'll be fun. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks for joining in.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.